Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Arlene Johnson, Associate Senior Librarian with University of Cincinnati Libraries and the co-director of the Digital Scholarship Center. And thank you for coming to our session this morning. Much appreciated. Today's event is the next in our series brought to you by the Digital Scholarship Center this year and UC Libraries. So I want to just quickly outline today this morning's session. After the session this morning, we'll have a lunch in the same place, and then we have an afternoon session at the Health Sciences Library that starts at 1:30 p.m. So I hope some of you can join us across the way, as it were. I'd like to begin the proceedings today by introducing Dan Gottlieb, Interim Associate Dean for Humanities, Social Sciences, and at UC Libraries, and then he'll be followed by James Lee, Academic Director of the Digital Scholarship Center and Assistant Professor in the English Department in the College of Arts and Sciences, and he'll give a more fuller introduction to our guest today. So thanks very much for coming.
Good morning. On behalf of UC Libraries, I'd like to welcome you today to today's Digital Humanities Digital Scholarship Speaker event. Thanks to all at UC who made this event possible, including Arlene Johnson, James Lee, Melissa Norris, Jenny Makowitz, Jay Senard, Don Jason, and Leslie Schick. Shimo Wong, our Dean and University Librarian, is traveling and is unable to be with us today, but he sends his greetings. This is our 7th event in this series, and today we welcome Blaine Greatman, Associate Professor of English, and David Eichmann, Director and Associate Professor in the School of Library and Information Science, both from the University of Iowa. So welcome and welcome. Thank you.
So I just wanted to, very quick introductory remark about Blaine and Dave. Blaine Greitman is an associate professor of English at the University of Iowa. He writes regularly for popular publications including The New Republic, Slate, Time, and The Week. His first book was The Poetics and Politics of Youth in Milton's England, published by Cambridge University Press. And his forthcoming book, Networking Early English Print, with Stanford University Press, is based on Shakespeare, which we'll talk about today, a digital project built in collaboration with David Eichmann. Blaine holds an MPhil from Oxford, where he intended on a Rhodes Scholarship, and a PhD from UC Berkeley. David Eichmann is the director of the School of Library and Information Science at the University of Iowa. He has conducted research in relational database theory, software reuse and reengineering, web search engines and intelligent agents, biomedical informatics, and ontology-based research profile harvesting and visualization. His current projects include Shakespeare, which he's going to present on, modeling the social network of the print community in England from 1450 to 1800, CTSA Search, which aggregates research profiles from 70-plus institutions, CD2H, an informatics coordinating center for the CTSA consortium, and linked data for libraries, where he's part of a consortium exploring the next generation of library catalogs. So the goal for today, this speaker, it's a slightly different format. What we wanted to do was highlight a very unexpected collaboration between a Shakespeare scholar in an English department, a journalist who writes for popular venues, and the director of the School of Library and Information Science who works in bioinformatics. And what we want, very much in the spirit of the Digital Scholarship Center, highlight sort of this borrowing of methods between these two fields. So I'll cede the stage to Blaine and Dave.
All right.
Join me in welcoming them, please.
Well, yeah, another way of putting what James just said is that I think he was interested in bringing us here because we're kind of an odd couple, and and sort of thinking about how that oddness results in a collaboration that I think is hopefully you'll find pretty exciting. I'm really excited to be here, and I just wanted to start by thanking the Digital Scholarship Center and the University of Cincinnati Libraries, Jenny and Arlene Johnson for making the arrangements and helping set up everything today. And a big thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences and its affiliated departments as well. This should be fun. So we're going to talk about how we built this project that James was talking about called Shakespeare. as part of a collaboration that brought together a project I started in the English department with a project that Dave Eichmann had started over on the medical campus. And the way the University of Iowa is set up, there's a river that runs through the middle of campus. And on one side of it, you have the English department and the arts and sciences. On the other side of the river, we have the largest teaching hospital in the country. And so we often sort of talk about, what happens on that side of the river or this side of the river. And I'll probably sort of lapse into that mode of speaking today. But because this is very much, about a project that sort of brings together the two sides of the river. This is a screenshot from Shakespeare, and some of you may have seen it, but I'll kind of talk about it a little bit before I start talking about how we built it and what some of the results are from it. So what Shakespeare does is mine the English short title catalog, which is a catalog of records for all books printed in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and the Americas before 1800. And it establishes links between authors. Up here I've got Shakespeare, this is Thomas Creed, this is Robert Greene. Links based on co-authorship and collaboration. So if Thomas Creed prints a book by William Shakespeare and they're both on the same title page, and that establishes a link between them. And you can use that then in various ways to find communities of collaboration, to see who is most connected within this network, or to trace paths between people. So here I've just traced a path between 1580 and 1600. If you look at the books in print, and the closest connection between Shakespeare and Greene is this printer, Thomas Creed. So it's authors, printers, publishers, and booksellers. And like I said, I'm going to talk about how we built it. And as I do, I want to try to address two questions that come up most often when I see people present on digital humanities scholarship. The first one is, what question does this project, or what questions does this project answer that can't be answered by close reading or other traditional humanist methods? I was just at a talk last week where somebody was doing network analysis of a single novel and looking at the way characters move through that novel, the places that they are, and building networks of showing them. And the first question that came up after the talk was, why couldn't you just read the novel and do that? And I think it's a valid question when you're at the scale of a single work. So I want to try to sort of think about why this particular tool might be needed. The next question, or the next thing I want to address, is the question of whether the questions that you're able to answer with this sort of project, or the answers that you produce, are real contributions to humanistic knowledge. So in other words, is there anything really humanistic about this use of technology, or are you simply taking a scientific tool and applying it to literature, ultimately in a way that's anti-humanistic? Conversely, does the project help inform the development of technology that's itself more humanistic, or does it help show the value of using such tools to ask humanistic questions? I think those are sort of big questions facing the work in the digital humanities. They seem to come up all the time in our department, especially from the sort of DH skeptics who usually turn up for talks to kind of try to poke holes in them. And I'm as James's introduction of me will tell you, I'm enough of a sort of amphibious creature to sometimes sort of count myself among the skeptics as well as among the practitioners. Okay, so the first question first, why develop Shakespeare? The reason I was interested in developing it is that I wanted to know more about the non-authorial agents involved in producing literature. Since the 1970s, literary scholars, are any of you from English departments in here? Okay, a couple. So I tried to pitch this broadly enough so that people who weren't in those departments would also have some insight into the kind of questions we ask. So since the 70s, literary scholars have followed Foucault and asking what is an author, and attempting to understand the sort of ideological and economic function of authorship. And as they've done so, they've traced the construction of author figures from Shakespeare to Donne and Milton, who are sort of the three big ones in my personal pantheon. I'm a Renaissance scholar, and so those are the three that I'm sort of most invested in the period. And as they've done so, they've increasingly turned to the study of coteries, which are sort of communities of writers or thinkers who are, or circles and networks, which are all terms that have become increasingly important in thinking about literature in the past 20 years or so. And so, as they've done so, like a book like this one by Arthur Marodi, John Donne, Coterie Poet, we've developed a richer understanding of the way a poem by Donne, for example, arises from a culture of manuscript exchange, a patronage community, an editorial work of sometimes generations of editors and publishers. So the past 10 years of literary studies has seen an explosion of works that talk about coteries, communities, circles, and especially networks. And this is just a little sampling of them. The thing that they all have in common, significantly, is that none of them apply any of the insights that have been yielded by network science over the past decade, during a decade when network science has transformed the study of biology and epidemiology, physics and biology. So all of these books, Jode Raymond is a good example. This is a massive book. Jode Raymond talks about how he's really interested in network science. He understands that it's transformed those fields, but he acknowledges up front in the introduction to that book that he doesn't actually do network analysis anywhere. He instead is still basically using networks as a kind of metaphor and sort of, hand tracing the connections between these smaller, tighter knit communities that are described here. So all of these kind of books talk about networks, but they very rarely explore links more than one or two steps beyond still some prominent author figure. And in doing so, they never really gain insight into the greatest findings of network science, which are much more interested in distant connections, sort of the way extended connections play out in the transmission of information and influence, or the changing dynamics of large, complex communities. And one of the reasons for that is that our best bibliographical tools in my field were built according to a hierarchical model that privileged the category of the author and the work above all, with booksellers and printers and these other figures mostly as an afterthought. And categories like community, assemblage, or network nowhere on the radar at all. In my field, the best example of that is the English short title catalog. This is a resource that began at the British Library in the 1970s when Foucault was still sort of an upstart assistant, and Bruno Latour, who's an actor network theorist, was still a sort of gleam in his intellectual father's eye. And it was and remains a sort of really important early version of a digital humanities project. It was a huge project. It was collaborative among 50 universities in the UK and America. It was funded by the NEH. It was a digital native project, so it was one of the first big libraries projects that was built using computers. But it was still basically, it was still put together using the old British Museum rules from the Victorian era that privileged author and work as the kind of defining categories that would be used to organize the data. And so here's a search. It's very easy to use it to search for an author. Here's a search for 1608 for William Shakespeare, so you can see the works that Shakespeare produced in 1608 or that were printed by Shakespeare in 1608. You can see that the author field is an authority record, so you have a birth and death date. The title field over here is the imprint, so this is a field that tells you what was on the title page. The publisher field, but you can already see here that, well, this is very regular. I mean, just even in this quick view, that things get a little bit funky in the imprint field. We'll sort of zoom in on one of the records. This is the record for King Lear. So again, William Shakespeare, authority record, King Lear, uniform title. There is, you can find this uniformly. And then this is the way the title actually appears on the 1608 printing of King Lear. Early modern publishers they didn't privilege brevity, and so it's, the actual title was Mr. William Shakespeare, his true chronicle, history of the life and death of King Lear and his three daughters, with the unfortunate life of Edgar, son and heir to the Earl of Gloucester, and the sullen and assumed humor of Tom of Bedlam, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of information actually on that title page, but there's not a really good way to access it in the way that the ESTC was built. Down here in this publisher field, you get what's on the title page: London, printed by Nicholas Oakes for Nathaniel Butter, sold at his shop. And you can see in the brackets that a cataloger has actually inserted the printer's name from the short title catalog. And so you can use the ESTC to search for works by Nicholas Oakes if you want to. I mean, catalogers did go through and they put that in, and you just as you can search the author field, you can search this big text field for Nicholas Oakes. But because it wasn't regularized, I mean, you can search it and you'll find 347 other examples of Nicholas Oakes. If you want to ask the question, okay, so what else did this guy print this year that he's printing King Lear? Are there reasons that he was drawn to this play? Does it sort of fit into some kind of publishing profile that he's developed? You can get a start on that. But because it hasn't been standardized, there's no authority record for him. If you search for N. Oakes, you get another 122 records. If you search for Nick Oakes, you get 7 more records. If you search for Nick Oakes, spelled this way, you get 3 more records, and on and on and on. So the field is messy and it hasn't been regularized as the author field was. And if you want to start sort of drilling down and thinking about communities of printers and booksellers, you can pretty quickly see how that could be problematic. Here's where that information comes from, just so I can sort of talk about how we might think about a book as a network. So this is a pretty typical sort of early modern title page. Again, you can see there's a lot of text here. This is 10 sermons. The font is not very good here, but the first few are by John Dodd. The 4 last are by Robert Cleaver. So that's what that field is where the author record comes from, and then it gets refined by the ESTC catalogers. Down here is where that publisher field comes from, printed by Thomas Harper for John Harrison, and to be sold by John Harrogate at the Holy Lamb in Paternoster Row. So that's so. The goal with something like Shakespeare is to try to think of this book. If you think back to that map that we showed earlier, the book is the link between Dodd and Cleaver and Harper and Harrington. All these people are linked in the little network by the book. So I think one of the first questions that you might have in an age of digital humanities study is why do metadata? Why look at networks this way? There are, after all, full text resources available. In my field, there's something called the early English books online, which has full text records for 60,000 books. You can do all kinds of things to analyze and study it and think about topic models with it. And the answer is that at scale, we've lost our, there's back. Maybe the NSA was That's nervous. The answer is that at scale, metadata is very powerful. This is a quote from Michael Hayden, who in 2014 was being asked about the NSA's surveillance program, which was not listening to full content of phone calls, but was just taking metadata and looking at who called who at what time. And at large scales of data, what Hayden is getting at is that it becomes very possible to sort of predict who is connected to who. If I know that person A is calling person B and person C is calling person B, and if I track those records over time and I see that those are repeated contacts, there's a pretty good chance that person A and person C know one another as well. And so at large scale, it becomes a pretty powerful tool for discovering communities and thinking about how they're involved with one another. I sometimes think of Shakosphere as being a sort of early modern NSA in some ways. The problem, though, is, as you probably already have a sense, working through the ESTC, it would be almost impossible to achieve that kind of the kind of scale that you would need to make sort of meaningful inferences about who knows who, about who's most connected, about what communities are actually important in the production of the literature that I study. I could first manually regularize a name like Oakes. I could do that search process that I showed you. I could then go through and find all of the other people that he printed in 1608, the year that he printed the text by Lear. I would then need to go and see all of the, those people who printed their text, or who were the booksellers that sold those texts. Are there commonalities there? I would need to go through the whole regularization process for that. And it would be very, very hard doing that to get more than 2 or 3 degrees removed from that central canonical work that I started out investigating, which I think is part of the reason that when you hear about networks in literary study right now, they are typically these small, close-knit networks, and they aren't really taking much account of the larger community. So as a pilot project, I was basically doing that when we started Shakosphere. We were hand constructing a database with a little seed grant that gave me money to hire a research assistant, and we were then visualizing those records in Gephi, which is a network visualization tool that some of you may be familiar with. And so my student was Katie. She met another grad student named Christine, and that student was Dave's student. And the reason I kind of have that pathway up there, something maybe we'll come back to later, but one of the big insights of network science over the past 20, 30 years has been that extended chains of connection are actually really powerful. We're most likely to to get genuinely new information about a job opportunity or a new technology or something by somebody who's not in our immediate circle, but by somebody who's several steps removed. There's a now famous article by Mark Granovetter about this phenomenon called the strength of weak ties. So Christine was a weak tie to me, somebody I didn't know very well, but met once, and she said, I think that what you're trying to build is the sort of thing that Dave Eichmann, my supervisor, is building over across the river. And she pointed us to this project that he was doing called CTSA Search, that was looking at co-authorship communities in these CTSA institutions. And so you can see on this little graph here, this is the links are co-authorships, and the institutions are indicated. These are individuals, but you can see by the shape and color of their their symbol which institution they're at. So you can see that there's like a little community with Duke, say, we're collaborating with Iowa. This is a search that shows co-authorship communities on people who are working on. The search that I did was gerbils and viruses. So gerbils and viruses are both showing up in their work, and they're connected through co-authorship. I'll come back to the gerbils and viruses thing later. It actually does have a connection to early modern literature, but I'll sort of leave you hanging on that one for a while. So when we saw this, we said, yes, that's exactly what we are hoping to achieve with Shakespeare. And so we approached Dave and told him we had a very funky data set of 500,000 records in MARC format. This is the 500,000 books in the English Short Title Catalog. And I'll let him turn it over to talk about where we got, how he took that and ran with it.
At which point Dave shrugged and said, 500,000?
Oh yeah, I should. So less formally, I should say that to me this seemed like a hugely insurmountable, because we had been sort of hand coding all this stuff. 500,000 seemed like big data, and so I went to Dave and said, "I've got a big data problem for you. I need help with this." It's a phrase that I had heard a lot: distant reading, big data. I've got big data problems, and I don't know if I have the processing power to do that. And Dave basically said, "Well, I've got the processing power under my desk to do that." And yeah, he sort of laughed and showed me his 60 million records or whatever he was working with.
So to pick up this thread of connection, Christine was a master's student in our Library and Information Science program and had gone through my database course and done a little bit of D3 programming, visualization programming. This is actually a D3 visualization you see over here. And so she shows up in my office and says, "There's this guy over in English who's just bugging the hell out of me. Would you at least meet with him?" And so, yeah, sure, I'll meet with anybody. Basically, directors meet with people. So Blaine came over and plopped down and said, "I've got this big data problem," and I chuckled at his 500,000 records and said, "That'll fit on your laptop, right? You've got more than enough horsepower in a modern laptop to mess with this kind of stuff." And it's true. That's what people actually under-conceptualize at this point, is that the paper he brought to me of an author, a scholar, who had been working in the 40s or 50s on the English Short Title Catalog, was incredibly proud of the fact that the guy had identified 24 people involved in a particular variant of publishing within the 480,000 MARC records that were in the English Short Title Catalog. Wrote up a whole paper on it. And I fired up my browser and did a quick query. I said there's 1,473, right? That's the difference that it can make, right? Because the query that they were looking for was hunting for what was not in the search indexes that library catalogs function on, but rather it was part of the text that was embedded in the record. And the thing that drives me in this space is that I basically build information spaces and navigable spaces. And in a great extent with what you see with CTSA Search and Shakespeare is an attempt to create directly manipulable visualizations that allow you to explore the space without having to learn the technology. These things are live graphs. You can push them around. You double click on one of these and you go to that person's profile at whatever institution is present. Right? The notion of what we do with the MARC records was catalogs were built to do one thing, and that was to get a patron from an information goal to something sitting on a shelf. Right? They were not intended to be anything other than intermediaries to access an artifact. And that everything we do with controlled vocabularies and authority records and all those librarian buzzwords, I say that carefully in this building, are really driven on librarians just trying to make their own job easier. But when you start looking at data at this scale, even modern catalog data, and usually at this point I dangle my external hard drive, I literally have the entire Harvard, Cornell, and Stanford catalogs as linked open data on a little box that's 2 by 3 inches square. The scale of what we can do with our current technology, and I can run the applications on my laptop. And admittedly, it's a nice laptop, but it's a laptop. Everything at this point is just how hot do you want your machine to get? Because information access generates heat entropy happens, and it's how long do you have to wait. And the challenge with interfaces like this is to get to the point where you don't have to wait. The Google generation gets frustrated after 15 seconds of latency. Right? And that's true of the professoriate as well as the students. So that's sort of the initial context. But it's also an interesting example of what in social network analysis is known as the boundary object notion. And that is, I didn't know Blaine didn't know me. These two graduate students knew each other, right? And function as an intermediary to create a collaboration between two individuals. When you heard my bio, it sounds like I get bored. I do. I once saw a paper describing how academics stay active through their career, and it was basically the notion of switching what you're doing about every 5 years. And I started ticking off, well, I started out as a database theory person and went into software engineering, and then yes, it pretty much is true. But by the end of that whole chain of exploration, you get to the point where you start seeing everything as structure and potential navigational flow. And so the core of CTSA search, which is basically a complex internal model and a bunch of visualizations, is exactly the same code as Shacosphere. It's the skins that are different and what you do with those interfaces. So, with that, Mark. Mark is an abomination. Mark is a holdover from the 1960s notion of computers being massive boxes with huge numbers of spinning tape, right? You see a science fiction movie from the 60s, you'll see nothing but spinning tape drives. The hilarity of this is usually the tape drives are spinning in such a way that you would snap the tape the first second of operation, but that's movies. The prospect is they were trying to as efficiently compact the information into a structure that was designed to be streamed onto a half-inch magnetic tape. And part of the structure of this is this value right here in red is actually the number of characters that this record is long. And if you think about that being a fixed slot, suddenly you realize that there's an actual maximum size for a MARC record. You can only put so much data into that record before you don't have an extra digit to indicate the length. Now that's changed a bit, but that was built into the specification for this compact MARC structure. And everything else that cascades down through this is basically just encoding effectively the equivalent of this, which is MARC as XML. Suddenly, volume explodes dramatically, but you're seeing the same stuff, right? You're seeing this pattern here showing up. You're seeing control fields, and then when we get to the good stuff down here, here's the 260 field, and only if you're a cataloger do you know that 260 is actually the publisher field. And from there, you have to worry about all these subtags and subfields, and it's arcane, right? It's not something that was meant to be humanly consumable. The stuff that Blaine was showing a minute ago is basically an unrolling of all that, and that unrolling has to occur every time you render that record on the screen, which is not something that's particularly amenable if you want to do mass processing of records and doing cross-linkage of this information. So that's the MARC version. That took a while for two reasons. First of all, the file he gave me was a binary MARC file. It had errors in it that blew up the MARC decoders, so I had to go in and edit the binary data. And also, he had failed to inform me that the text was encoded in Euro ASCII instead of US ASCII. And so I was getting garbage out because of things like umlauts and diacriticals. So part of the challenge in this space is that the exchange of information is frequently in, shall we say, something less than optimal form. Right? And part of my world these days is getting past this initial hump. I was doing the same thing this weekend, actually, with one of my faculty. was interested in SNAC, which is a social network collaboration for archives, and they've got tons of really interesting data and no description about how to get it out of their system. And I spent the majority of Friday evening, rather sad I admit, basically coming to the point where I could actually figure out how to grab the JSON for the search result. And from there, everything else just cascaded. So sometimes these puzzles have these really interesting stop points where if you can't get past that, if the data is distributed in an arcane form like Mark, the majority of researchers who are interested in playing with this aren't going to get anywhere. So what we then do is say, well, can we get away from this into something that's queryable? And the answer is yes. Here's a separate view of it. It's the same text, except we've peeled away the mark structure, the XML markups. Here are the primary tags, and here's the subtags, and there's the text. So now we've got something that's relatively viable. And from there, it's a quick database view materialization to something that's beginning to look like something you can play games with normal queries, normal SQL queries. I say normal because I live in SQL and Sparkle is query interfaces. But from there, you'll notice that the title field is nice and clean. And when you get to the publisher field, it not only has interestingly variant spellings, but it also has all these brackets. And those brackets are annotations of where librarians, as Blaine mentioned, have dropped in filler, right? But if you're going to look at this as text to be analyzed, all it does is break words up into meaningless sequences of characters, because brackets are punctuation, they're not words. So from that perspective, suddenly I'm faced with the prospect of, I've got to clean the data up. How am I going to clean the data up? Well, it turns out if you just get rid of the brackets, it's fairly readable. So this one was pretty easy. So then you drop into 260. And here's the one that Blaine was mentioning, printed by Nicholas Oakes for Nathaniel Butter. Now, if you understand English, you know exactly what's happening here. You've just been told who the printer is as a person, a named entity. And the for, if that person that's in that prepositional phrase, and I'm unfortunately going to school you in English syntax here for the rest of my part of the talk. If it's not the author, what we're looking at is the name of the publisher. Now, something interesting popped out as we started working with this data. You start looking at the graphs, and pre-1650 or so, all of the dots are blue and orange. No green dots. And in our legend, green dots are publishers. And then all of a sudden, and all of the blue dots are directly connected to the orange dots. In other words, authors are going straight to a print shop and saying, here, print this for me. And what you can do as you run through time on this is you can actually see the birth of a profession. And that profession is publishing as a profession. Because all of a sudden, authors start to become halos around the publishers, and the printers become secondary objects in these graphs, right? Because they're basically under contract to a publisher, which is what our current structure is. The other thing that really was curious that happened as this started popping out was I started getting all these female given names. And if you think about, if you ask any number of literature people, and I have done this, how active do you think females were in the print industry in pre-18 England? And they'll pretty much say not, right? It's true. I mean, there's multiple females present. Clearly not just the widows of some guy who dropped dead at 40 and she took over the print shop, but females are actually running their own print services. That kind of information that just sort of pops out as a secondary effect is what I find really intriguing with this type of data. But you have to get to the point where you can tell that. And so, with that, what do you end up having to do? Well, first of all, what initially sometimes appears to be a relatively simplistic thing is, what are the words? What are the words here is pretty simple. In the English short title catalog, it's a relatively trivial lexical analyzer. When I start talking about my PubMed data and my biomedical literature, my lexical analyzer has 250,000 internal states. And I can't make it any more complex because it breaks the compiler. And that's because I will recognize a valid chemical formula, which is full of parentheses and symbols and so forth, as a single token. Discipline to discipline to discipline, you can't just say, white space is my boundary detector, and periods and pluses and minuses. If you want the equation to show up as a whole equation, you have to be able to understand what equations look like lexically. Right? So that's a first, in this case, relatively simple step, but a critical step as I teach my natural language processing students. Second, in this space, this gets really a little funky with this because of the fragmentary nature of the publisher field, where are the sentence boundaries? In the PubMed data, nice, tidy sentence boundaries. Here, it's all over the map. But the interesting bit, unlike modern MARC records where a publisher field is going to be, Random House, New York City, right? You've got these descriptions of people's history at a pub and whatnot. It's remarkable how many printers are nearby pubs. My father was a printer. And finally, if you've got the sentences, or a fragment of a sentence, we can now start using everything we learned in 9th grade English about syntax and grammar to really start getting careful about retrieval. Now, why do you need to do that when it's a pattern like this? Because most of the STC looks like that. Right? TOH with no period as an abbreviation for a person. Run-on sentence with a semicolon, variant spelling. The other thing that really is intriguing about this is that individual people can't spell their own names the same way across two different records, let alone getting into, is it two V's or a W? But we get to here. So we have a noun phrase with a verb phrase, and then a subordinate verb phrase, two subordinate prepositional phrases, each of which have noun phrases. This is your flashback to 9th grade sentence diagramming. But if we've got that, we can now do this. So again, for the ESTC, it takes about 480 some extraction rules to basically do everything. We're at 2,500 for our acknowledgments work in scientific papers and growing. So we've got this, which means if we think about this sort of just stripped out like this is basically just a flattening of that tree we were just looking at. And the reason why I put this up this way is that we can then do something like this. Now we can write a query. And this is a structural query that's going to go rummaging around in the tree saying, can I match this pattern? And so what it's looking for is a verb phrase whose the first slot is the word printed, followed by somewhere a prepositional whose first word is by, and the second slot's a noun phrase that's exactly 2 tokens long. And I want the first 2 tokens tagged, and the parentheses are, I want that one and that one. And what that gives me is, because of this being here, I know this is a printer, and I know the first name is Nicholas and the second name is Oakes. And bang, we've got a record in the database as a nice, clean record. No matter what else was going on in the sentence. And notice that pattern will work for this one and for that messy one down below. The 486 rules come from the fact that there's enough variation that we have to write a bunch of different rules for all the different occurrences. And similarly, you can do the same thing, except now we're asking for 4 here instead of by, and you notice that that's the only difference between these two. You can actually start seeing patterns in what you want to do to extract, and this time, because it was 4 instead of by, we know we've got a publisher, and that publisher's name is Nathaniel Butter. Which, with a little bit of massaging of the resulting structure, using the ESTC IDs, turns into something you can graph, right? Where we now have, in this case, notice we've got authors. The green are the publishers. This is far enough down the line, the publishers have started to take over. We've got a printer here with a number of publishers and a number of authors. And what you're seeing here is that there's a community emerging of people for even a given year having relationships among themselves. And that there are other smaller discrete communities lurking around within the same time frame, but not having that commercial network of publishing that we're seeing present there. All right, so where does that take us with this? Well, the prospect is this is a static snapshot at a single point in time. Right? When you start looking at the temporal animation of that, you can see that graph grow, adapt. Portions of it go away, portions of it appear, right? Those types of patterns you can't see in just the text. Even if we show you all the data for this, you would never see the fact that we've got this interesting little ring and that there are some key individuals. You notice in this case, a key individual linking these two communities is actually a publisher, but a key individual across these two communities is actually an author that's actually dabbling in both sides of that fence. Looking at those connections are the interesting bits, right? At least from my perspective. Because effectively, that's Blaine's graduate student and my graduate student. And you can think about Blaine being this or Blaine being that. I'm not going to worry about the size of our relative graphs.
All right. Yeah, so as you can see, there's a tremendous amount of potential out there in these existing projects. Like I said, the fascinating thing about ESTC for me is that it was this Herculean effort that the history of it is really interesting to read. The kind of the turf wars and the resources poured into it. It's all sort of sitting there waiting to be used, but it does take some work to get there. So what I want to do next is talk about some of the results that once you take this and you start to analyze it and think about in network analysis, a person like this who's joining two communities is somebody with a high degree of what's called betweenness. So they have a high number of shortest paths. If I want to get from this community to this community, I go through them. That means they have high betweenness. The large nodes are people with a high degree. That means just that they have a lot of connections. And so there's ways that we can analyze it and think about how you find those people when you're looking not at a small graph like this, but a really big graph across a big stretch of time. Before we do that, I thought, before I jump into the results, which will get us back as well to the to the gerbils. That's a gerbil graph, but I'll save it for a minute. I wondered if people might need to get up, get a drink of coffee, have a snack, or ask questions for a few minutes, because we've got the room for a while. So it seemed like maybe a good time to stop talking at you and let everybody wander around, ask questions.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
About the ESTC as a graph, which raises questions about mapping and space. And I've recently been looking at the English Broadside Ballot Archive out of
UC Davis.
Santa Barbara.
Oh, yeah, it's at Santa Barbara now. That's right.
Right, and so they've got visualizations of ballot printers over time, plotted in London. So I'm wondering if you've explored the spatial implications of these communities, which are so suggestive spatially as they're visualized as graphs, but they're probably just human communities and not geographic in any way.
Let me go all the way back to that. All the way back to here. If you look at this record, there's so much interesting spatial information, right? To be sold at a shop in Paul's churchyard, at the sign of the Pied Bull. And even up here, you have, in the long extended title, you have, as it was played before His King's Majesty at Whitehall, upon St. Stephen's Night at Christmas holidays. by His Majesty's servants usually playing at the Globe on Bankside. And so we have been doing that. We've actually just done a big new extraction to pull out a lot more of that place data. And we've also collaborated, I don't know if I have a slide on here, but we've been working with the Map of Early Modern London, which is an online map run by Janelle Jenstead out of University of Victoria. And so if you go to that map, that's through this link open data framework that Dave can talk to a lot better than me. They have a gazetteer that lists place names, and we're able to bounce our database off against that and take you can pivot from, if actually we could just go to the live site and do this maybe for a second. Do you wanna show that really quickly? So yeah, we have been doing that. I think there's more to be done. I'm really interested in moving past visualization and into analysis, where we're actually sort of asking questions about place instead of just visualizing it. We haven't,
Right.
and that's part of the reason we've just done this big new extraction that we haven't actually turned loose live on the site yet.
So what Janelle's got is basically this, a hand-drawn sort of weird Google elevation map of London. And she has sort of milestones, well-known places identified. What we've got is everything that fills in the gaps. Well, not everything, but relative to this being like Paternoster Row and this being a particular church, and the phrasing that we get is usually very relativistic against that kind of stuff. And so what we've done is attempt to map up her gazetteer against the names we pull out with the idea that we can bind her identifiers to our identifiers, and in doing so, jump between the two systems. So if I come back over here, and I'm just going to do a quick click somewhere and grab somebody at random. With any luck, and I lucked out. So here's a peel out. So in this case, here's a person name that we peeled out, a publisher, and we've actually identified Aldersgate as a place. And Aldi 3 is actually a reference in Janelle's world. And if we jump to the map,
She has a really aggressive zoom feature on this, so get ready. It may.
here we go. There we are. That's the cool part.
Yeah, so it's pretty exciting. We've been because we've got this really granular detail, sort of shops. She's got Paul's Churchyard, but we'll have different shops in Paul's Churchyard. And Peter Blaney, this a bibliographer, actually I'll be talking about it a little bit more here in a minute. He went through and did a sort of very careful mapping of where these shops were, and we're trying to work in the next stage with sort of zooming in beyond that to think about even more where things are relative to one another. So yeah, I think that's an exciting sort of next stage, and the ability to cross-link these projects is something that's also really exciting.
And actually, this afternoon, most of my talk is about that kind of mashup in the biomedical context, primarily because there's so many huge resources that you can use in that space. But it's increasingly the case that we're finding the ability to do that in this domain as well. Talking about the SNAP group and using VF as a catalog crosswalk mechanism. We started exploring, there are Wikipedia entries for these streets, right? So you actually pull photos of the streets out of Wikipedia when you start making these connections. And that type of mashup is really sort of a next step for us.
You got a question?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to get my head around the size of this project that you're working on. And maybe this isn't the right moment for discussion. If not, we can come back to it later. That's totally fine. But I'm just wondering, how many people are working on this with you? And if you could say a little bit more about the collaboration, like what motivates each of you to collaborate with each other on this, and how does that sort of work out?
I mean, you're looking at us basically. We do have a
Yeah.
grad student who's doing some of the disambiguation right now. One of Dave's grad students. So for me, it very much was those sort of humanistic questions, like thinking more about communities and thinking about something I'll be talking about in a minute, which is how, and that Dave alluded to a little bit with like female printers, like who are the people who our standard histories of the era have sort of overlooked, whether those people are the artisans who are producing the books, or whether they, whether they were the people selling the books, and exerting different sorts of agency that can be really important in thinking about the sorts of literature that ultimately becomes canonical. Why does a given printer who has agency and decide to print a book, in this period, or why does a bookseller decide to sell one? I mean, so I was interested in that primarily, and also just interested in building something that was actually that was public facing, and that my background is partly journalism. I still write a lot of journalism, and I like scholarly monographs. I like writing them, but I do think that the digital humanities just has a good potential to engage broader publics, and that's a non-negligible reason to do it. And I think that for Dave, part of the reason he was interested is because the data was messy. But I don't know. You can speak to that.
Actually, it's true. One of the things that's interesting about working in this space, with this kind of technology, is when you deal with a single data set, you begin to sort of narrow your world to the problems of that data set. And in doing so, basically fail to be able to step back and see more robust solutions. Right? So the prospect of taking 27 million bibliographic citations and 70 institutions worth of here's an author for that publication against something as crufty as the ESTC, and then at a later point throwing in actual real catalog data and starting to mess with authority identification there, means that, yes, Shakespeare started out as basically a fork of CTSA search. And then we did stuff over in Shakespeare that I thought, this is really cool, let's do it over in CTSA search. And so what happens is the two systems sort of ratchet each other up in terms of functionality, because an idea appears in one side of the fence, and we end up saying, well, there's no reason why we can't back off to a generic solution and plug it into both frameworks so it works well across everything.
Yeah, and sometimes because Shakespeare is actually, a sort of small, with 500,000 records, it is sort of small. It's some things that are computationally intense, you can sort of play around with them and try them in Shakespeare, I think, in a way that, so if you go back to that map that where the betweenness map, let me see if I can.
You just
Okay, let's see. Where is your? I don't know where your cursor is.
What have you done?
I'll just do this. Okay, if you want to figure out like who in this whole network has the highest level of betweenness, or you want to like rank the people, the top 10 for a given period. It's relatively easy to count up degree, how many connections a person has, but to calculate high levels of betweenness, you have to do millions and millions of calculations, because you have to calculate the path, between every one of these nodes in the network. And so it takes, like even with the Shakespeare data, the first time that I started doing that kind of work, you've got to turn it loose on your computer and then wait a while. But you can see if there are interesting and important things that emerge from that, and whether it's worthwhile, I think, playing those sorts of games with the bigger data sets that Dave is usually working with. So I think that's been kind of an advantage of the small size.
Plus, it's a puzzle.
Oh, yeah.
So going along with the level of betweenness, eventually as you get more information, will you be able to take the level of betweenness and correlate it with location on a map in terms of like how close these people are in proximity to how strong their level of betweenness is?
Yeah, or sort of, I think so, right? I mean,
Yes.
and one of the things that would be interesting is even to take a particular space, right, on that map like Janelle has. It's like, who are the highest degree people in this space and in this space, or the highest between them? So yeah, we should be able to do that. We're not doing it yet, but we're not that far away from being able to do those sorts of things. You're already actually. I just saw that David added some things to CTSA search, which are getting there, right? You're bounding things by mileage now, and
Yeah. So we actually use those spatial clues to disambiguate people too over time, because you'll see variations of a location description, and you're trying to decide whether these name variants are the same person. But if all those name variants are marked with a dove on Fleet Street, it's more than likely the same individual. So those temporal clues are really handy. But it's also the case, coming back to the Wikidata stuff, is there's really close lat-long coordinate data in the Wikidata, which means between that kind of stuff and Janelle's stuff, yes, you can start saying, well, okay, so instead of talking about who's working with who, let's talk about Fleet Street as a publishing location. What happens at that place over time? Because you can basically turn the problem inside out.
Yeah. So I think that's, and again, one of the things that's cool about the ESTC data is that it's not we've been talking about London, and I study English literature in the 17th century, but it does include, things that were printed in Scotland, Wales, in the early Americas. So you've got, you've actually got a pretty geographically diverse data set there. Actually, some of that will come up here in a minute. One of the figures I'm going to talk about. Okay, so I think I'll start talking about results a little bit. Oh, yeah.
Is there any correlation with the stationers' catalogs?
Yes, so a lot of, well, for one thing, the STC, which a lot of the data that's in the ESTC comes out of the STC, which was using the stationer's catalog as one of the sources. The stationer's catalog has also now been digitized. And so it's one of the things that we've got in our sort of bag of things to think about integrating more fully with this, because it would be. I think it would be interesting to add a layer where you can see when people are registering their books.
And the one book that Blaine mentioned a few minutes ago, somebody's hand-drawn neighborhood maps and then provided historical, at such and such a location, so and so was running a print shop and then it became a bakery, and there are tons of these sources lurking out there that, when you start coming back to the mashup question, become reinforcing information to disambiguate who and what and where.
All right, so once we've done that, I'll go back. Got to this stage, it becomes possible to visualize the data and trace paths. But the other thing you can start to do is query it. There's a very powerful network analysis program called NetworkX. That's a Python language that's been the go-to tool for physicists and epidemiologists and those communities who want to ask questions like, given a very big network, who is the most highly connected node in this network? Who has the highest betweenness? How can I sort of slice that network into communities so I can think about which communities are the closest knit ones? And so that's what I did, and that's sort of back end stuff. It's actually not on the site, most of that analysis, but I'll talk a little bit about what we found and what's been exciting to me as we've done that. So the first thing that we found is that there was a sort of phase transition as you move from about 1580 up to 1600, in which many small disconnected communities join into one large giant connected component. Basically what this chart shows is the percentage of nodes that are connected in the largest community against, down here in red, the percentage of nodes that are in the second largest community. And as you can see, they're basically the same down here, because you have a lot of sort of one-stop shops, basically, who are printing and selling books out of their shop, working with a few authors. But at a certain sort of critical point right in here, you have this explosive growth and the connection into one giant connected component. Giant connected components are interesting because when you have a network like that, a large complex network, that's when it becomes possible to play interesting games with it. Like some of you have probably heard of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon exercise, where you can connect any actor in the Internet Movie Database to Kevin Bacon within 6 degrees. That's the sort of game that you can start to play when you have these extended networks with lots of people connected. These networks are also interesting because they are the sort of networks where information, say, can go viral and can travel across in a sort of small disconnected network. It's easy to sort of for a new trend or a new piece of information to die. The sociologists are interested in these big extended networks because you'll have a trend, say, like a new way of wearing your sneakers. This is some of the sort of work that first got sociologists interested in networks in the 70s, and how does that trend move from East Coast to West Coast? It's these connections between teenagers in all these cities across the country in this big extended network. Part of the reason that I was really interested in it, as somebody who studies the 17th century, is that we talked all the time in literary studies about a print revolution. This was the sort of Elizabeth Eisenstein model of what happened in this period of print, is that there was a print revolution. It transformed knowledge transformation. And over the past 20 years or so, most book historians have sort of been backing away from that model and talking more about a print evolution. And so looking increasingly at the way other modes of publication, like manuscript publication and circulation, persisted alongside print, the way older modes of reading practices persisted alongside print, and sort of moving back away from this idea of a print revolution. And it's always sort of bothered me a little bit because so many of the figures who lived through that moment describe print as this sort of explosive new phenomenon. So you have people like Luther who describe books spreading like a public fire, or like a virus, like a plague, an infection. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, about this transition is that it allows you to maybe see that when they were reaching for those sort of metaphors, they actually were observing, I think, a real phenomenon that they were choosing their metaphors quite astutely for. This chart here is a chart that shows, so one of the reasons that epidemiologists are interested in giant connected components, like I said, is how information spreads, but it's also how viruses spread. So this is a chart showing the spread of plague through a community of Kazakhstani gerbils. These gerbils in Kazakhstan live in burrows, and the burrows are connected by tunnels across vast swaths of land. And so basically, if only a few burrows are occupied, if 10% of the burrows in one of these big networks are occupied, if a family of gerbils gets the plague, they just die, and it doesn't spread through the whole system. But once you cross this a threshold, which is 33% occupancy, when one gerbil gets the plague, they sort of all get the plague. It spreads really, really quickly. And so when you're thinking about the kind of sense of early modern people, that suddenly books were everywhere, that these ideas were really hard to stop, I think that this kind of phase shift or phase transition is interesting and significant. The other thing that's interesting about giant connected components is that within those kind of complex networks, degree distribution is not normal. It's not evenly distributed. So in these kind of early disconnected communities, most people have about the same number of connections. Most printers who are operating, they're publishing a few books. But when you have a big complex network, it doesn't operate like that at all. You tend to have the vast majority of nodes that have a few connections, and you have a few who are hyper-connected hubs. And so this is a map of degree distribution in U.S. airports. And most U.S. airports actually only go to very few places. These are airports like the one that Dave and I flew out of to get here. Went to Cedar Rapids. Cedar Rapids Airport basically flies you to Chicago. Chicago is one of these airports that are out here, one of the few hub airports that connect everywhere in the country, everywhere in the world. And that's a very characteristic, what's called a power law distribution. And it's very characteristic of these kind of complex networks. And you'll notice it looks very similar to, this is degree distribution, 1564 to 1616. I just ran those dates because that's Shakespeare's lifetime, and it seemed like a good sort of touchstone. So most people, if you look at this network over time, they have a few connections, but this has a extremely long tail. It actually it would go out into the hallway. And there are some people who are hyper-connected that are way out on that long tail. So then it gets interesting to say, well, who are those people? I mean, what sorts of people are they? Well, you can use Network X to pull them out. You can see in terms of what sort of people they are. They're all printers, and that makes sense because a printer is going to have a lot more connections, print a lot more books than an author is. You can break this down by role, which I'll get to in a minute. But even among the printers, some of them are far more, I mean, these are the top 10. And even within that top 10, you see that there's a sort of tremendously quick drop-off. And when you go down into the 12 or 15, over this lifetime, there are some figures who really do stand out. So these are them. You've got people like Nicholas Oakes, who we were looking at earlier, Thomas Creed, et cetera, et cetera. Now, coming back to the question of sort of humanistic results and why as a humanist you might be interested in this sort of project, I've sort of used as one of the rubrics for thinking about the way historians and literary scholars think about who matters. There's a resource called the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and it claims to be the sort of the record of who's who in British history. If you've ever looked at there's a interesting digital humanities project called 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon that plays on the Kevin Bacon name. It uses that as its sort of data set to think about who knows who in early modern England. So these people are not listed. Yeah, they do not have entries in the DNB. So most of the people who come up as the most connected in early modern England do not have entries in the DNB. Almost the only ones that do, the few that I'm getting ready to take away here, tend to be people who printed a lot of Shakespeare. It's that it's basically the canon. It's the people who are most closely connected to the most canonical authors who tend to turn up. Okay, so Nicholas Oakes then is the most connected person during this period, the most connected printer. It's interesting because if you look at what we know about Oakes or what's been said about Oakes by literary scholars, you wouldn't get the impression that he was an important or significant figure. This book came out recently by Brian Vickers, The One King Lear. In that book, Oakes basically comes off as a dolt. He's a doofus. And the reason that there are big differences between the different versions of King Lear is because Oakes was such an incompetent buffoon that he just he ordered the wrong amount of paper, and then he started cutting text. And I mean, according to Vickers, Oakes is he's truly incompetent. It's not a great book, I will say, but that's one. But I mention it because it's one of the only ones that actually mentions Oakes. The other big book that has mentioned Oakes is by Peter Blaney, The Texts of King Lear and Their Origins. This is a sort of thorough bibliographic investigation into the text of King Lear, and as such, he has a unusually detailed description of Oakes. But Blaney is almost like apologetic for writing about this marginal figure. Even in this book, he's devoted years of his life to writing about the text of King Lear. And what he says about Oakes is, Oakes is of some interest in the wider context of Jacobean play printing, and can, in several ways, be considered usefully representative of the printers responsible for many of the more important pre-Restoration quartos. It's a pretty humble claim about this guy, an embarrassed sort of claim, and it's also wrong. I mean, as you can see, so if this is our map for this period, Oakes is not representative of anything. He's way off here. Once you get down to the number 10 printers, you're in this area, but he's out there somewhere. He's a real freak of connectivity, and and there are reasons for this. And when you dig into it and you start with the question, well, why is he? And you look at his career, and this is not using digital tools, just using old-fashioned bibliographical humanities tools. You see that what Oakes did is at a pretty young age, he first he bought a joint share in a print shop that was mostly devoted to publishing big theological works. It would publish, print a few of these each year, and then really quickly he manages to take over the print shop using a little bit of sort of conniving methods. And then within a year of him taking over, he totally tears it down and rebuild. Not literally tears it down, but he tears down the business model that they're operating in. They never print another big book again. He immediately shifts over to printing things like news Corinthos, to printing things like playbooks, and to collaborating. Anytime he's involved in a big production, it's him reaching out and working with many different people. And producing big books, but much faster than they would be able to be produced by a single shop. And so he is still involved in the production of big books, but they're big books which are produced at this kind of accelerated pace. And so there are real reasons for him to be highly connected, and they don't seem accidental at all. It seems like this is a person who had a very clear sort of model in mind. You don't sort of accidentally totally reconfigure your business model in a year and then stick with that model throughout your career.
One quick comment.
Yeah.
And one thing to note about this is that total impact by that individual, unless you go back to looking at those name variants and figuring out that all those variants are a single individual, you basically break down that impact and they start disappearing back into the pack.
Yeah, and you also can't get it just by counting, which is sort of how we use, you can count up how many things Oakes prints, but you get a really different sense because you don't see what you don't see then is all the collaborations that he's involved with. The way he's actually involved with not just printing a lot of things, but printing things by a lot of different authors, printing in collaboration with a lot of different people. His books are being sold in many different bookstores instead of just one particular shop. Okay. I don't know. Oh, I don't know why that's there again. Here's a list of highest degree booksellers. 1623, so that's the year of the first folio of Shakespeare, to 1640. There are reasons that I configure the dates that way that I won't really go into, but I was interested in the period leading up to the Civil War, basically, if the data changes in 1640 in interesting ways, because there's the Court of Star Chamber, which is the licensing, it's in charge of censorship and licensing, is abolished, and so there's kind of this explosion of new titles. So I took it up to that. So let's see. This is highest degree booksellers. Fewer than half of these names are in the Dictionary of National Biography. Now, this person, Michael Sparks, who's the highest degree bookseller during this period, is in the Dictionary of National Biography, but really is a kind of side note, and mainly because of his relationship with William Prynne. Prynne was this radical Presbyterian. He's most famous now for writing a book against stage players called Histriomastics. This is a contemporary engraving of Prynne. He was taken in a star chamber and had lost both of his ears in the pillory and fined $5,000. So he was pilloried, he has his ears cut off. And this was about this book that was published in 1633, Histriomastics, which holds some position in English studies because he mentions Shakespeare, for one thing. He doesn't like Shakespeare. He doesn't like that Shakespeare's books are being printed on good paper, better than most Bibles. And because of this kind of famous, this famous martyrdom where he's put on the pillory and has his ears cut off. And I was telling James earlier that when you start thinking about Spark reminds me in some ways of somebody like Doctor Who or maybe Forrest Gump. I don't know which model is better. In that there are all these kind of critical moments in English history where you realize that he actually should be right here. This is a Victorian engraving of the scene. And what is missing is that Spark was also forced to stand on the pillory by Prynne. Prynne was the one that had his ears cut off. Spark had to stand there with a paper in his hat and hold a book. This was the first public book burning in England. They gathered up all the books they could find and burned them. And Spark is this sort of interesting ghostly figure in a lot of these kind of critical moments in English literary history, especially as they lead up to the Civil War. Here's another one. So Prynne got into trouble a few years later in 1637. This is Prynne, Burton, and Bastwick in the pillory, although I can only see one of them, so I don't know. This is from a German engraving. This was an internationally famous event in 1637. It was one of the sort of flashpoint moments leading up to the English Civil War, because it was a moment when these three sort of hot Presbyterian writers had their books called in and were accused of sedition and libel, and who were publicly humiliated and punished for writing. And it was seen as a kind of one of the big oppressive moments of William Laud, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, of his reign. In this engraving, this is Laud on his deathbed. I don't really know why he's on his deathbed in that way, because he was executed. I think this is a demon, I guess. But this was such a flashpoint event that, like I said, there are engravings of it in England. The one thing, in Germany, it's a moment in England where people are sort of forced to choose sides. You're sort of either with the Laudian church establishment in Charles in some ways, or you're or you sympathize with these people who have been sort of publicly martyred. 1637 is a key year, for example, for people like Milton, who really seems to start becoming radicalized at that moment. Now, what all three of those books have in common, even though he's not there, is that they're all published by Spark. He's the sort of central connecting figure. Well, that's not the only thing they have in common, but that's one thing. He's somebody who publishes them all. He's also somebody who, even before Prynne, had actually staked out a much more radical position in defense of a free press than Prynne ever would. Spark himself had been called before Star Chamber in 1629, and he's the first person who ever connects the right of free printing to, he invokes Magna Carta and the liberty of the subject. And so I think it's really possible to sort of see Spark and Prynne and Burton in some ways as as figures who are useful to Spark as much as Spark is useful to them as a bookseller and a publisher. He clearly has a kind of long game in mind. Laud, partly because of the reaction to things like the humiliation of Burton, Bastwick, and Prynne, was executed in 1645. This is a satirical print that shows Burton giving him an emetic. You can see that Laud is actually vomiting out books here. He's saying, "Oh, Mr. Burton, I'm sick at heart." And Burton is saying, "And so you will till head from body part." And as Laud pukes out the books. Again, what's interesting about them all, so down here at the bottom you see that he's one of the orders that the books that he's puking out is an order of Star Chamber. That's an order to call in. The accompanying text makes it clear those are the books that Spark has been publishing and selling in his shop, and also selling all across London. Spark is the first person in the English record who describes himself as a wholesale bookseller, meaning that he's not just publishing books or acquiring books to sell out of his shop, but he's really interested in the way he can get books in other people's shops too. And again, that kind of explains why he's a high degree figure. As I said, Laud does indeed get killed. Here's an engraving, a fairly famous engraving from Wenceslas Haller, showing the trial of Laud. And finally, here we see this is Spark. This is the only known likeness of him down there, prominently placed in the crowd. He's actually brought Wenceslas Haller, the engraver, over for the Netherlands. Spark is really interested in illuminating his books with a lot of visuals, and Haller depicts him here at the trial. But he's not just kind of a narrow Puritan publisher, which is, when he gets mentioned, it usually is in association with Prynne. It's like he's Prynne's printer is the phrase that will come up in the few people that talk about him. But like I said, I think it's interesting to think about how Prynne was useful in a longer game that Spark was playing, rather than Spark just being useful for Prynne. Prynne, part of the reason that Prynne was a forerunner in defending a free press is that he had this real investment in this sort of early this movement that was known as Pan-Sophism. It was most characterized by a person named Hartlib, Samuel Hartlib, and it was interested in universal education and spreading information across the globe, and also in going out in a sort of Baconian way and gathering information from around the world. And so Spark is the first person who publishes, for example, Mercator's Atlas in English. He commissions this translation. He actually writes a little poem on the frontispiece that the MS is Michael Spark. There's the London printed for Michael Spark and are to be sold at the Green Arbor. This is his second edition of this text. To print and translate Mercator's Atlas is not just simply to pick up a copy of an atlas and have it translated and printed. Every time the atlas gets printed, there's new information added. What Spark is particularly interested in is he's really interested in the New World. And it turns out that he's actually got a cousin that lives in the Bermudas, and he's got a brother that lives in Virginia, and they both act as book agents for him, and they also send information back to him. So they're distributing books all through the colonies. In his will, he leaves hundreds of books to the children of the colonies, so they're shipping them back and forth. He's so interested in updating the atlas, partly to make it more sellable compared to competing atlases, that when he publishes this one in 1633-34, he actually includes a note. I don't know if you can read it there, but it says, in page 905, for the description of New Spain, read New Virginia. But there is no map for Virginia. I can't hardly read it. as there is a more exact map drawing in that country whose platform has not yet come over, but when it is the buyer, for every buyer of the book shall have it giving him gratis. So you buy the book with a kind of placeholder map in it, and then when the new map is finally ready, you take it back to the shop and you get a new book. You get a new copy of the map. Here's the map that was not yet ready, but it eventually does become ready. It doesn't look very good up there. He augmented it with all kinds of maps, though. This is an updated version of John Smith's map of New England that also appears in it, and this is, in this state of the map, it's the first time that you ever get the correct location of Boston on a map of the New World. Here's another map that he includes of the West Indies, where again he has these contacts. He clearly has a mind to selling a map like this separate from the atlas, as well as selling it as part of the atlas, and he includes various different measures: Spanish leagues, English leagues, and Dutch miles, all in the key of it. He sells these things internationally and not just in the English market. And like I said, he is part of what's behind things like publishing Mercator's Atlas is that he clearly has a business interest in the New World, and so he's interested in producing an atlas that gets at that. Part of it is that he is in the circle of this guy, Samuel Hartlib, who is a really fascinating figure. He's this German immigrant to England. John Dury, one of the contemporaries of the period, called him a conduit pipe of things communicable, because Hartlib just wrote hundreds, maybe I think thousands of letters. He was writing to everybody in Europe, all the sort of people who would later become the Royal Society folks. He's sending them books constantly and exchanging books with them. And the books that he's sending are books that he's having published by Spark. Spark becomes the person who prints his books by the educational reformer Comenius. He prints some of Hartlib's books. He's very much engaged in the Hartlibian project. And so this is actually drawn from that 6 Degrees of Francis Bacon site that I was telling you about. And one of the interesting things is that you won't see Spark connected to Hartlib on here. You don't really get a sense of Spark's importance at all. He has a single connection in that project because it picks up that he was Prynne's printer, and that's it. And so I think when you think about Spark's career, as with Prynne, you realize, though, that he also is a kind of conduit pipe for all things communicable, and a person who's worth thinking about in the period. So I'll just conclude by saying, I coming back to some of the questions that I opened up the talk by saying, the reason I studied the Renaissance is I'm fascinated in it as an age of discovery. And part of what really excites me about writers like Marvell and Donne and Milton is their own interest in the sort of shaping power of the instruments through which we view the world, whether those instruments are telescopes or microscopes or atlases or other texts, like how they configure our understanding of the world. And part of what I find exciting about digital tools like Shakespeare is that the process of building them, one, allows us to experience firsthand the kind of collaborative methods by which those tools arise. So if your goal is to think about non-authorial agents and how they're important in the generation of knowledge, then you get a little taste of how that works, and in some ways more than I think you do when you're writing a scholarly article or a monograph. And the other thing is that you can use such tools as instruments of discovery, and as you do, I think they also highlight the shaping and sometimes distorting power of new existing resources. So thinking about the way we've organized our information, the sort of structures of information that we build in library catalogs and other works, and how they prioritize certain sorts of agency rather than others, whether we're talking about library catalogs or literary anthologies. And so I think I'll conclude with that and open it up, and hopefully we'll have some questions. Thanks. questions or comments. We can also like mess around with the website if we want to do that. So anything you want to do.
I'm still reeling from the abomination that is Mark Records. I'll be thinking about that for a while.
It's yeah. They were. I mean, they really were. So to go back to the ESTC project, when they started that project, it was a paper-based project, and they switched. And within about 2 months of it, I can't remember what the machine was that they bought, but they were one of the first cataloging projects to start going straight to machine, and they actually they would send out forms to libraries all across the world and ask you if you had a copy of a book in it, and you would fill in the information if you could match it, and then you would send it back, and then the cataloger at the British Library input that data.
So going back to the extraction rules, and you created the pattern of pulling out who published or who used to work. Did you find that sometimes individuals put their middle name or multiple names in the title page that would affect pulling out just 2 of the nouns?
Right. Well, remember I said we had 486 rules.
Okay.
So, I mean, at the core of that volume of rules is the variability of how anything gets expressed. So,
Sometimes you just get an initial, say, and so you've got to. So I would, as we were going through that process as well, I would kind of regularly go back and say, well, I'm not finding this person, or I know this book is listed this way, but I don't see it, and we come up with new rules to find those people.
And so what I glossed over here, I was going to touch on it a bit this afternoon. So if you think about the depth of that syntax tree for a given sentence, the short one, printed by so-and-so for so-and-so, that tree's pretty shallow, right? You think about the depth of the other one, and you can get trees, well, particularly in acknowledgments on scientific papers, that run on for a couple thousand words because they're lists of people and so forth. The complexity of those syntax trees are such that you can't anticipate each variation of a tree as a whole. So what I do instead, if you think about picking a point in the tree and saying, I'm only going to do 2 levels down and chop everything else off. If you start at the bottom, you can promote up, okay, well, this noun phrase is a person, and now we get this person and that person, but we're not looking at their individual names, but the entity types then. And what you could do is look at the frequency of those things, and you pick off the fact that most of the noun phrases for people are first name, last name. And then going down one of those power law curves, here's another rule that picks up another 25%, and then another rule that picks up 10. And by the time we're down in the 5% range, Soli's going crazy because she's looking
She's
at...
a grad student.
Yeah.
She's been working on a lot of this.
Because she's been staring at these rules now for 3 weeks.
And you do get down, so there are a couple people who like the way their name is configured is so odd, and and this that they're probably still hanging out there. One of the things that's interesting about doing the kind of big network analysis that yields the kind of stats that I was talking about is that those individual cases don't really have much bearing on the kind of big statistical picture when you're thinking about different ways of measuring importance and influence in these kind of networks. So, the goal is to get them all ultimately, to capture them all. But you can also network scientists have run various kinds of experiments that show that if you have a giant connected component, you can remove a huge proportion of the links from it before you can't trace the paths, because a lot of the paths are going to be repeat paths between, so if somebody's collaborating 2-3 times and you do lose one book, or say they're collaborating 100 times and you lose one book, it doesn't really alter the overall picture that you get from the data.
And the domain specificity also comes into play here. So in this space, people's names, even though the actual spelling of the name can be quite variable, you don't get a huge number of titles in front of people's names. Assistant professor, with all sorts of variations now, abbreviations are going and so forth. Or, in my other reality, the variability in how people mention an NIH grant number and whether or not it's the same grant number across two papers. If you've ever seen one of these grant numbers, it's this long alphanumeric string that at its core is unique. Everything else is just specifics of what year are you in the grant, and was it a renewal or was it a first? But recognizing them all as a common thing becomes the critical aspect. And this comes back to, for me, at the core of this is really a problem in identity discovery and identity management. Within a single source, given the name variability, but also across multiple sources when NIH lists the name or the grant as one way and you get it differently because, oddly enough, NIH investigators, biomedical researchers, for the life of them can't correctly quote their own grant numbers when they do their acknowledgments. So that kind of cleanup occurs almost all the way down through the process. The more you expose, the more you realize, well, this is pretty noisy. And coming back to looking at MARC records and authority structures, you start lifting this stuff out and you start realizing that, yeah, it's an authority record, but the reality is that for this particular person, there are 3 different authority records in a single library catalog because no one ever saw them lifted out as discrete things.
Actually, even
And
here you
aggregated.
can kind of get a sense of how that, right? Like, there's a lot of Nicholas Oaks, quite a few in Oaks, but it starts to drop. The variance starts
Right.
to drop down pretty fast. So when you can clean up a lot quickly, actually.
So the interesting bit was, from a rules perspective, 50 to 100 rules gets all of this data for Blaine, right? That's the data he's working with. The deeper data doesn't change his statistics at all because all it's doing is just picking up the variations. But those networks are so robust to information loss that it ends up not really mattering. And so for the English short title catalog, I'm willing to inflict the pain solely of having to go all the way down and let's do every single extraction rule. But I'm looking at the biomedical stuff, and there's no way that we're ever going to get close to the end of that tail. There's just going to be data we basically say we're never going to try to extract it because we don't have enough time in our life to do it all. So it's sort of, let's do the low-hanging fruit first. So first name, last name is a really good entity recognizer for people. And we'll worry about the other ones when it comes to the point where we're missing stuff.
So what tools do you use for refining the data?
Should we bounce over to the?
Sure. So the lexical analyzers are all, so I do all my stuff in Java. So there's a tool called JFlex where I can just specify regular expression patterns and it'll give me a lexical analyzer. So that first path is just coding up a sufficient set of rules to get clean lexical terms. The natural language parsing is all off-the-shelf Stanford parser stuff. The Stanford NLP group's got a really nice, robust parser. We early on were using the Carnegie Mellon link grammar parser, which is a little older. But it really doesn't matter because you get so many variant alternative parses out of this. That's something we didn't mention. Is that these things are not perfect. But if you take, okay, well, give me 6 parses out of this sentence, right? Then whether or not it's correct or not doesn't really matter because if you're consistently using equivalently badly constructed sentence trees, you can still pull the data out clean, even though the sentences are bogus from an English perspective, right? Because the program is consistently failing in the same way.
I was going to see if I could.
So that's a form of cleanup that's pretty subtle. And then from there, we get into this mode.
I was trying to see if I could pull up somebody and actually disambiguate their name on the fly, but we've done quite a bit of work. So we also have this. Let's see, this one, Timothy.
Well, no, this one's actually not bad. So here we've got T. Rogers as a first name abbreviation with a burst here, and then come down here to a Timothy Rogers, and the reality is that those two individuals are ostensibly different individuals, are co-occurring. And can you scroll down?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, at this point, we've got no location. Well, actually, we do. Here's Fleet Street for this guy, if we go all the way down.
Okay. Yeah, once we
And
get
we don't
this
have
next
location
pass
data.
of extraction, we're going to have a lot more location data
Right.
that helps you say, okay, is this T. Rogers Thomas or is he Timothy,
Right.
based on where he's located? And then we've done the easy ones here, but then you pick whether T would be a secondary rather than a primary, and you could merge that with the appropriate one. And early on in this stage, you could just do a whole big list of them, and just click yes. And the easy ones have been done.
The other thing about this is, for Timothy Rogers, you'll notice that we end in like 1710 here, and then there's another verse at 1790. That's a 70-year gap. The likelihood of that being the same person is pretty low, given life expectancy at that time.
And so you can go through and
So you can
split.
actually split it right there into two different records.
And right now, we're just doing manual splits, or when I run the analytics, I'm splitting it manually into lifespans. But you can do this, and then you just create two records now. So the two different Timothy Rogers are now registering as two different people.
And coming back to my earlier comments about direct manipulation, I don't have to train you in anything other than click on a bar graph or do two check boxes to do this work. So the ability to take, a relatively off-the-street master's student in her first year and hand her into this space and be effective at it is the point of the exercise. Because the idea in the long run is to crowdsource this kind of activity. We've been less than successful in convincing people to loan us their clicks. But
I guess this would probably be a lot more common in like the Dark Ages, but I wonder if you saw people wouldn't take credit for their own like individual works.
Yeah, there's much anonymous printing and publishing in the period, and I don't have my computer hooked up. I've got some examples of that are sort of interesting. You also have a lot of false title pages. So you'll have somebody like Andrew Marvell sometimes, using a false imprint, so saying something was printed in Geneva instead of printed in London. This is one of the things we're having a 30-year project run by the British Library is really helpful, because often using the STC and the stationer's catalog, they, even when something is anonymous, they have inserted it if the author is known. And actually, the ESTC is an ongoing project, so still, if you find something that's this fake, for example, there's an Andrew Marvell poem that's listed on there right now that's not actually by Marvell, and you can click a little button and send them and ask them to correct the record, although it takes them forever because their funding ran out. So yeah, you do see that. And one of the thing that I've got on a slide, the way that I'm trying to use that in interesting ways is this kind of comes back to the NSA quote that I had earlier about how Michael Hayden talks about using metadata to kill people. In network science, there's this principle that triads tend to be closed. So person A knows person B, and person C knows person B, then probably A and C know one another as well. And there are predictive algorithms that are based on that to try to find likely missing links. So if you have a text and it's anonymous and it's within this community, who is which community is it closest to? Who is likely to be involved with the production of it? And NetworkX has a ton of different link prediction algorithms, and I've used them in ways that have been sort of promising. They tend to get you in the ballpark of who might be responsible for a text. Like, I've tried it with some text that I know who wrote it, even though it's not on the record. There's sort of updated bibliography that or at least it gives you there's a scholarly conversation about who might have been the publisher, say, of Milton's Areopagitica. And when you run some of the link prediction algorithms, it's pretty good at actually achieving something like the scholarly debate about who was involved with that thing. It'll give you the sort of top 5 most likely links.
Something I didn't note here is it's one of these be careful what you wish for notions. So if we go back to just picking a random record, I always grab this era because the time frames are relatively simple. So if you look really, really closely up here, the URI or URL for this thing is person.jsp, PID equals 1662, which is the identifier of the record. It's the primary key of the row in the database table. Well, come to find out that the Wikidata people found us, and all of a sudden we're turning into authority.
They're voracious. They scrape data like crazy, and so they pulled down all our PIDs.
Yeah, so all of a sudden I can't wipe the database out and start over
So
again.
now we have to be really careful about when we do refine data, like preserving those PIDs because they're already linked up with various wiki pages.
Yeah. So,
That's been the sort of, because like I said, we've just done this big pass, this new extraction pass, and that's what Dave has been trying to figure out is how to deploy that all without breaking all those links.
But actually, here's another good example, because this burst of activity is all in the 1500s, and then there's a bar out at 1730.
Yeah, so you got to figure out.
Definitely
if
not
that's-
the same person.
Other questions?
Actually, we don't have locations for him. Too bad.
That actually could be a mistake in the ESTC catalog, that one that's way out at the bottom, because
Oh, yeah.
look at the spelling of it. That's not
Oh, yeah.
1729 spelling.
No, it's not.
That's somebody who made a cataloging error probably in the ESTC, is my guess.
I'm wondering, does each mark on the bar graph represent an individual title? Or because often you have, for a lot of reasons, people whose work gets suddenly popular and reprinted again decades or even a century after they originally wrote it. Sometimes stolen, sometimes attributed to them.
Yeah. So those are the numbers of publications. That's why I was wondering if that could be. With authors, that's true. With printers and publishers and booksellers, we figured we could put a pretty clear boundary on their lifespan.
Right.
So,
Actually, just look at it. I mean,
well,
this one are all the same title. Right. What it basically is an indication of the number of our ESTC catalog records that we're working with. Right? And the question is, are these actually separate publications or not? Is something we didn't try to address.
EST's pretty good at it though, because they, especially the pre-1640 part of the ESTC is all based on the what's called the ST, the short title catalog, and it's the best part of the ESTC data. They've gone through and so usually those are actually editions of a given text and
Printed by different people.
yeah, that's a pretty solid part of the data. That's part of the reason going back. I didn't really explain my logic for only going up to 1640, but that's part of it. Is that that's the STC era, and so it seems most reliable to me to do analysis on. When you move into post 1640, it's different. It's based off the Wien catalog, and it's really rich data, but it's not as highly refined.
The other thing we haven't done with this data, there's a remainder component of the title. And you start looking at this, and so here's a reference to Henry Stallbridge, right? We haven't lifted those names out at all yet, but these title and remainder fields in this era are just really dense with text.
Great Antichrist of Rome. Could get one for the Antichrist.
And their
maybe.
filthy father.
Question?
All right.
Not. Thank you so much.
Thank you.